Have you ever just been so sure about something, like that gut feeling, and then it turns out you were totally wrong?
Oh, yeah, we've all been there. Those moments when intuition leads us astray can be pretty illuminating, though, right? They really make you question how your mind arrived at that initial certainty.
Totally. And that's exactly the kind of mental puzzle we're going to be unpacking in this deep dive. We're tackling the work of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning author of Thinking Fast and Slow.
It's a book that really revolutionized how we understand the inner workings of our minds, especially when it comes to decision-making and judgments under uncertainty.
A big part of what makes Kahneman's work so groundbreaking is the way he lays out this framework of two systems, of thinking, System 1 and System 2. Such an elegant way to describe those often competing forces within our minds.
Absolutely. And to fully appreciate the brilliance of these two systems, we need to talk about the incredible partnership between Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their collaboration was really the foundation upon which so much of this understanding was built.
Reading about their dynamic is fascinating. Kahneman often described Tversky as the more logically minded one, someone who thrived on clear, precise thinking. And Kahneman himself was much more drawn to the psychology of perception, how our senses shape our understanding of the world.
That's right, and it was this very difference in their approaches that made their partnership so powerful. Kahneman mentioned how much they both enjoyed the process, too. They brought this sense of playfulness and curiosity to their work, which you can really feel when you read their writing. It doesn't feel dry or academic. It's engaging, almost like you're part of their conversation.
They also had this incredible respect for each other's ideas, even when they disagreed. Kahneman talks about how Tversky could often articulate Kahneman's own vague intuitions better than he could himself. Talk about a meeting of the minds.
And their work together had such a wide-ranging impact. Their early research on heuristics and biases, which we'll definitely be getting into, became hugely influential, not just within psychology, but across fields like economics, law, medicine, even public policy.
It's amazing how their insights into these fundamental human tendencies have really shaped how we understand decision-making in so many different contexts. So let's dive into the heart of it. This idea of two systems, System 1 and System 2, operating within our minds. Can you walk us through who these characters are in Kahneman's mental psychodrama?
Of course. Think of System 1 as your brain's autopilot. It's the fast, intuitive, automatic system that's responsible for your gut reactions, your first impressions, those quick judgments you make without even realizing you're making them. It operates effortlessly and often without your conscious control.
So that's System 1. It's like that flash of recognition when you see someone you know, or that immediate sense of unease you get in a situation that just feels off. What about System 2?
System 2 is the more deliberate, analytical side of your mind.
Right.
It's the system you engage when you're solving a complex problem, making a conscious decision, or trying to control your impulses. It requires effort, concentration, and it can be quite slow compared to the speed of System 1.
So while System 1 is shooting from the hip, System 2 is taking its time, weighing the evidence, really thinking things through. But it sounds like System 2 can get a little, lazy sometimes, right?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things Kahneman highlights. System 2, though powerful, can also be quite lazy and easily distracted. It often prefers to go with the quick and easy suggestions of System 1, even when those suggestions might be wrong.
I think we can all relate to that. It takes effort to really engage System 2 and think critically, especially when System 1 is offering such a tempting and seemingly plausible answer. This dynamic really comes into play with the concept of heuristics, right? These mental shortcuts that our minds often rely on.
Exactly. Heuristics are like rules of thumb that System 1 uses to make quick judgments and decisions. They're often very useful because they allow us to navigate complex situations without having to engage in a lot of effortful processing.
But the downside is that these shortcuts can sometimes lead to systematic errors in our thinking, what Kahneman and Tversky called cognitive biases. Can you give us some examples of these heuristics and how they might trip us up?
Sure. One of the most well-known heuristics is the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily we can recall examples of it. So if something is highly salient or has been in the news a lot recently, we might overestimate its probability, even if it's statistically quite rare.
Like if there's been a recent plane crash, we might suddenly become much more afraid of flying, even though statistically it's still one of the safest modes of transportation. Our minds tend to overemphasize what's vivid and readily available in our memory.
Exactly. And another common heuristic is representativeness. This is where we judge the probability of something belonging to a certain category based on how well it matches our mental prototype or stereotype of that category. The classic example here is the Tom W. problem.
Hmm.
People are given a description of Tom that sounds a lot like a stereotypical computer science student, and they tend to overestimate the probability that he's actually studying computer science, even when they're given information about the base rate of computer science majors being relatively low.
So we get so caught up in how well the description fits the stereotype that we neglect the crucial statistical information about the overall prevalence of that category. And that can lead to some pretty bad judgments.
It certainly can. And then there's anchoring, which is another powerful heuristic that affects how we make estimates. This is the tendency to be influenced by an initial value, even if that value is completely arbitrary or irrelevant.
Like that example where you ask people if Gandhi was older or younger than 140 when he died. Even though that number is obviously way too high, it still anchors their subsequent estimate of his actual age at death. It's pretty wild how much an irrelevant anchor can pull our judgments in one direction or another.
It really is. And what's even more interesting is that anchoring isn't just about insufficient adjustment from that initial value. It also seems to work by priming our associative memory. The anchor makes us think of things that are consistent with it, which can further bias our estimates.
So the takeaway here is to be really wary of the first number that's presented in a negotiation or when you're making an estimate. It's likely having a much bigger influence on you than you realize. What about the law of small numbers? That seems like a trap we can easily fall into when we're looking at data or trying to draw conclusions from limited samples.
Absolutely. The law of small numbers is this tendency we have to overgeneralize from small samples. We see patterns and jump to conclusions based on very limited evidence. This can be especially problematic in fields like medicine or business, where decisions are often made based on preliminary data or small pilot studies.
It's like we have this innate desire to find meaning and coherence in the world, even when what we're seeing is just random variation.
That's a great way to put it. We're pattern-seeking creatures, and that can be both a strength and a weakness. And finally, there's the conjunction fallacy, which is a fascinating bias that demonstrates how our intuitions about probability can sometimes be wildly off.
The classic example here is the Linda problem. People are given a description of Linda that sounds like she might be a feminist, and then they're asked to judge whether it's more likely that she's a bank teller or a feminist bank teller. And most people say feminist bank teller, even though logically that can't be more likely than just bank teller.
Right. It's because the description of Linda as a feminist bank teller just feels more coherent, more like a complete story. Our System 1 loves a good story, and it often overrides the basic rules of probability to create one.
So we have all these heuristics and biases operating largely beneath the surface of our awareness, influencing our judgments and decisions in all sorts of ways. The big question then becomes, how can we apply this knowledge to make better decisions in our own lives?
Well, the first step is simply becoming more aware of these cognitive biases. Once you know about them, you can start to notice when they might be at play in your own thinking. Like the next time you're reading a news article about a sensational event, remind yourself of the availability heuristic and consider whether it might be influencing your perception of the actual risk.
So kind of like a mental checklist. Okay, I'm feeling really anxious about this. Is this a legitimate concern, or is it just the availability heuristic messing with me? What about when it comes to things like making purchases or negotiating? Anchoring seems like it could be a real problem in those situations.
Absolutely. One practical tip is to try to establish your own independent estimate of value before you encounter any potential anchors. Like, if you're buying a used car, do some research on the fair market value before you even talk to the seller. That way, you have a reference point that's not influenced by whatever price they might throw out there.
That's great advice. So preparation is key. What about representativeness? Are there any strategies we can use to avoid falling into that trap?
Whenever you find yourself making a judgment about someone or something based on how well it fits a certain stereotype, force yourself to consider the base rates. How common is that category in reality? Don't let the vividness of a particular example or a compelling narrative overshadow the underlying statistical probabilities.
So basically, don't let System 1 run wild with its storytelling. Engage System 2 and ask for the hard data.
Exactly. And when it comes to the conjunction fallacy, just remember the basic logic of probability. The likelihood of two things being true together can never be greater than the likelihood of either one being true on its own. So if you're evaluating different scenarios, always make sure you're comparing apples to apples and not letting the more detailed or emotionally appealing option sway your judgment.
This has all been so helpful for thinking about how we make decisions in our personal lives, but these concepts also have huge implications for how we operate in a professional setting, especially in management and leadership roles, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd argue that understanding these cognitive biases is even more crucial in a professional context, where the stakes are often much higher and decisions can affect entire teams or organizations.
For example, how can we apply the understanding of cognitive ease to make better decisions in a team setting?
One important thing to be aware of is that ideas presented clearly and fluently, using familiar language in a well-structured format, might be more easily accepted by your team simply because they're easier to process, not necessarily because they're the best ideas. As a leader, you need to be mindful of this and create space for the less obvious or more complex ideas to be heard and considered.
It's like actively countering the bias toward cognitive ease. Don't just go with what feels most familiar or easiest to grasp. Make sure you're digging deeper and really evaluating the substance of the ideas, not just the packaging.
Exactly. And the availability heuristic can really shape the agenda and priorities within a team. If a particular issue has been highly visible or someone has been very vocal about it, it might receive a disproportionate amount of attention, even if other less salient issues are actually more important.
So as a leader, you need to make sure you're not just reacting to the squeaky wheel. You need to step back and look at the bigger picture, consider all the relevant factors, and make decisions based on a more objective assessment of priorities, not just what's top of mind at the moment.
Right. And representativeness can be a real problem in areas like hiring and market analysis. We might get so caught up in looking for candidates or market segments that fit our preconceived notions of success that we overlook others who might actually be a better fit or have greater potential.
It's about not letting those mental shortcuts dictate your decisions. You need to actively challenge those initial judgments, consider the base rates, and make sure you're looking at the full range of possibilities.
And when it comes to things like negotiations and strategic planning, anchoring can have a huge impact. The first number that's thrown out there, even if it's totally arbitrary, can really set the tone for the entire discussion or plan.
So being aware of this effect is crucial. You need to come prepared with your own independent assessments of value, and you need to be willing to challenge those initial anchors and consider a wider range of possibilities. Don't let yourself get boxed in by that first number.
One really helpful technique for breaking free from the anchoring effect in strategic planning is something called a premortem. This is where you imagine that your plan has failed and you ask your team to brainstorm all the potential reasons why it might have gone wrong.
That's a great idea. It forces you to think critically about potential weaknesses and blind spots that you might otherwise miss because you're so focused on the positive outcomes.
It's a great way to counteract that natural tendency towards optimism and make sure you're considering all the potential risks and challenges before you commit to a particular course of action.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's really given us a whole new way to think about how we make decisions and judgments, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional roles as well.
The key takeaway here is that by understanding these two systems of thinking and the various biases they can introduce, we can become much more aware of our own cognitive processes and ultimately make more informed and effective decisions in all areas of our lives.
So for you, our listener, here's something to think about. Take a recent decision you made, maybe a big one, maybe something smaller, and try to analyze it through the lens of System 1 and System 2. Were any of those heuristics we discussed at play? Did anchoring, availability, or representativeness influence your thinking? What might you do differently next time, knowing what you know now?
It's all about continuous learning and refining how we think and make decisions. By becoming more aware of our own cognitive processes, we can harness the power of our minds more effectively and avoid some of those common pitfalls that lead to bad judgments and choices.
Thanks for joining us for this fascinating exploration of thinking fast and slow.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And we look forward to diving into another thought-provoking topic with you next time on The Deep Dive.